welcome to this edition of Getting to Know Your Indiana Neighbor. Now, today's neighbor is not even a native Hoosier, but he's certainly one of the most recognizable and celebrated Hoosiers we have. Don Fischer, thank you so much.
You bet.
I mean, to do this with Don Fischer, it's certainly a pleasure, it's an honor, but we're not going to talk so much about IU basketball or IU football. We're getting to know our neighbor, Don Fischer. So as we normally do, we're going to kind of start from the beginning, Don, if you don't mind. Although we won't go through however many years, but we'll hit the highlights. So if you don't mind, telling me where you grew up and your parents, what did they do?
My dad was a farmer. My mom worked, well, my parents were divorced when I was 4 years old.
Okay.
And I'm a twin.
Are you?
Yeah. My brother and I, we grew up in, basically in Rochelle, Illinois.
Familiar with it.
We lived with our grandparents for 3 years after the divorce, out on their farm. And then my mom remarried, and we lived with my mom and my stepdad until I graduated high school.
In Rochelle?
In Rochelle.
Wow. All right. So what did 10-year-old Don Fischer want to do when he grew up?
He wanted to play baseball. Or football, or basketball, or whatever the sport was at the time.
Most whatever 10-year-old boys wanted to do, right?
Yeah,
back then.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you a pretty good athlete?
I was an okay athlete. I wasn't a great athlete. I was an okay athlete. I was probably better at baseball when I was in Little League and all those kinds of things. Got better at football when I got into junior high and high school. Played a little basketball up until that time as well. But when I was a freshman, my brother and I made the freshman basketball team and quickly realized that we were out of our element.
Really?
Yeah, we weren't good enough.
Okay.
So at any rate, football and my brother wrestled, I wrestled. We did a lot of different things in high school, all athletically inclined, but not good enough athletically.
Okay. Well, then let me rephrase the what did you want to do? Let's go to 16 or 17 years old, when you knew that you weren't going to become a Major League Baseball player. What aspirations at that point, if any, did you have professionally?
I did not like school.
Okay.
Was not a very good student. Didn't pay attention. My brother knew what he wanted to do when he was in 7th grade. He wanted to become a Lutheran pastor. And that's exactly what he grew up and did.
Wow.
I, on the other hand, had no clue. I really wanted to be in sports in some way, get involved in sports. But again, I wasn't a great student. My grades were just average. I graduated from Rochelle High School. The day I graduated, I went to work in a factory. Literally did a whole bunch of different jobs the first year or so I was out of high school. And then I settled down to a job with the railroad. I worked as a ticket clerk, a nighttime ticket clerk, in the depot at Mendota, Illinois. We had several trains that came through. Most of my job in those evenings was to either sell tickets to the trains, which were 3, I think, that came through as passenger trains. But the rest of the time it was sorting mail. I literally unloaded freight cars and put bags on these long carts and things that they had there, and then separated that mail after you got it off from the train itself. Then you separated that mail into several different carts where people would come by and pick up the stuff for their little communities in other towns besides Mendota. So, and then of course I did bills of lading and all the kind of stuff you do in a depot in addition to selling tickets to the trains. Well, my shift was 9 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning.
Oh my.
And the shift was that until they said they were going to get a weekend guy. So that I wouldn't have to work 7 days a week. So that was supposed to take me maybe 2 to 3 weeks that was going to happen. 7 months later, they found the guy.
Yeah.
I worked 7 days a week. I had 1 day off in that 7-month period.
You weren't married at the time?
I wasn't married at the time. And then I got married during the time I was there.
Okay.
Anyway, so I'm working in the depot one night. And at this point, this is during the 7-month period, I was working every day. Or every night, I should say. And during that period of time, one night I sat down and had my sack lunch that I packed for myself, and started reading Sport Magazine. I got to the inside back cover, and I saw this ad, and it said, "How would you like to be a sportscaster?" And I went, that sounds like something I think I could do. And I started taking, I actually signed up for a course from Career Academy in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Career Academy is where I took this correspondence course. They sent you a tape recorder that was about
I
this
can picture
big.
this.
This is about this big, this yay,
Yeah.
3 3/4 speed. If you know anything about radio or
Yeah.
television or anything at that time frame, that was a really slow turning tape recorder. But you would do your lessons on the tape recorder, send the tape to them. They would critique them. They would send them back to you, tell you how great you were, which you weren't at that time, but they were trying to instill confidence,
Sure.
as you know. And literally got about halfway through it. Actually, uh, as soon as I started these classes, I went up to our local radio station and just went in there one day and asked if I could see the program director or whoever would be who I'd be allowed to talk to in regard to just hanging out there. So the program director and I started talking, and he said, "What do you want to do in radio?" And I said, "I want to be a sportscaster." And he said, "Well," he said, "there's a lot more to it than that, especially in small town radio. You're going to have to do just about everything other than being an engineer, unless you have engineering skills." I didn't have any of those. So literally, I started going up there every morning. After I'd get off at 6 o'clock, I'd go up there and spend a couple of hours and watch what they did and how they went about their business. And then I became their gopher. And literally, I ended up having to call the morning guy who was coming in at 6 a.m. to sign the radio station on. Several times I had to call him because he'd been out the night before, a little bit late, and wasn't up and hadn't signed on in time. So I was the guy in charge of making sure he got up and got the radio station on the air for a while. So I got about halfway through this correspondence course, and one of the guys that I met there, one of the announcers, was a guy named Chuck Kenworthy. And he left, I guess maybe a month before, well, about 3 months into my correspondence studies, he left and went to a radio station in DeKalb, Illinois. And of course, I kept in contact with him. So one day I call up there just to talk to him, and he goes, or he didn't answer the phone. And so I asked for their front office, and they said, "Who are you looking for?" And I said, "Chuck Kenworthy." And he goes, "Well, he's not here anymore." And I said, "Well, where's he at? Did he get fired?" And they went, "No, he left and he went to Butte, Montana."
Butte,
I said, "For a job?" And he goes, "Well, we think so." So anyway, I got his phone number, called him up, and I said, "Why'd you leave your radio station in DeKalb, Illinois to go to Butte, Montana?" And he goes, "I want to get into TV. And there's a radio station and television operation in Butte, Montana. It's co-owned by the people." And he said, "I think I can get a shot there at some point in time." I said, "Well, that's interesting." So about 3 weeks later, he calls me up and he says, "How far are you along in your correspondence course?" I said, "About halfway through." And he said, "Are you good?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm better than some people think." I said, "But the people at Career Academy keep telling me I'm pretty good at what I'm doing." So he says, "Well, would you be interested in coming to Butte, Montana?" And I said, "For what?" And he goes, "To be an announcer." I went, "You're kidding me." He knew I wanted to get in sports, but he said, this is not a sports job. This is basically just getting into radio. It's an entry-level position." He says, "It'll work out perfectly with your schedule." I said, "What's that mean?" He says, "The shift is 9 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning." I said,
my.
9 hours? He goes, "No, you'll be on the air for 3 hours.
Okay.
You'll have a lunch break at midnight. And at 1 o'clock, you come in, you'll be the janitor." He says, from that point forward until about 4 o'clock in the morning. And at that juncture, you'll be the farm director. So he said,
"You had some experience."
"Yeah." Well, I told him, I said, "Look," I said, "if I come out, do I have to come out there to interview?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah." So I said, "How am I going to get there?" And he goes, "That's up to you."
Yeah.
So I hung up the phone. Next day, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking, I work for the railroad. I'll take a train.
Take a train.
So I literally took a train, and it went from Mendota, Illinois, to Kansas City. And in Kansas City, you switch trains, but the train you were with now had 2 passenger trains on the back of a freight train. And so I was one of the only passenger going and coming that was on that train for a passenger, just to be a passenger,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I get to Butte, Montana. I interviewed for the job. I thought the interview was horrible. I came back home thinking there's no chance I'm going to get this gig. And about a week later, I get a call. This guy says, if you want, or Chuck Enderwood, he actually called me. He says, if you want the job, they'll hire you. So they were having trouble finding somebody, is what the whole thing
But
boiled
you
down to.
said you were married at this
Yes.
point.
Yeah.
So you and your wife head to Butte, Montana?
Yep. And a child.
And a child.
Yes.
All right. Well, at least you got into radio, right?
I did.
But was it what you expected?
Well, it was very much what I expected because I had been up to that local radio station and had a feel for what they did, and I understood it. You were a disc jockey in those days. That's what they called you.
Yeah.
And I loved the disc jockey shift. It was really fun. It was a rock and roll radio station.
Okay.
So it was music that I liked as well, and that's how I got into it. And I was out there for about a year and a half. Came back home. I just knew I wasn't going to get a sports job there. I literally did statistics for the guys who did play-by-play on Friday nights because my nights off were Friday and Saturday. So I didn't have to work Friday and Saturday nights. Sunday, back to work again. But I could actually go with the sports guys that did play-by-play, and they did some high school games and stuff like that. And I went with those guys and kind of got a feel for what was going on in that regard as well, even though I'd taken courses in this career academy thing that didn't really give you play-by-play experience at all. I mean, they didn't even talk about that. Basically what it was you were doing newscasts and sportscasts and things like that, enunciation of pronunciation and all those kinds of things that you learn, the very basic fundamentals of broadcasting. And so that was what I was involved with. And literally I was halfway through when I got this job. I never finished the course.
No.
I was getting practical experience.
Yeah, I never heard you say anything about an FCC license. Back then, at least in Indiana, you had to apply and get an FCC license before you went on radio. Was that
that's correct?
You had to?
I still have that.
You still have that?
I still have the little card.
What year are we talking?
That would have been 1967.
And you still have the card?
Yeah.
When I got into radio, it was a week after they stopped doing it.
Really?
I'd studied for the test. This isn't about me. Let's talk to Tom Fischer. But it's interesting, though, because I grew up in a similar area, and I wanted to ask you, it sounds like you weren't serious about sportscasting until you looked at that ad and said, I think I can do that.
Correct.
So you weren't like myself and other 10-year-olds who were out in the backyard simulating ball games of your favorite announcer.
I actually did some of that back in the day when I was, it was probably, this would have been the first couple of years of high school. I got put in the outfield. I played shortstop up until I got into high school, and then they sucked me in the outfield, and I got bored, things like that. So I would actually do Harry Carey.
Wait a minute. While you're out in the outfield?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You do a pretty good Harry Carey, don't you?
Used to.
Used to. Okay, I won't ask.
Yeah.
Unless you want to offer, I won't ask.
No, I'm not. I'm not nearly as good as I used to be.
Okay. But that was your guy.
But Harry Carey was my guy. I loved Harry. Yeah. Jack Quinlan was a broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs way back in the day as well. Yeah. Another guy I liked listening to. But the guy that I probably felt, not that I was closer to from a broadcast perspective, but the guy I thought was one of the best I'd ever heard was a guy named Dan Kelly, who did the play-by-play for the St. Louis Blues.
Right.
He was terrific. His inflection, how he went about his business. Harry was one of those guys that he made stuff up.
Yeah.
I mean, he'd make a foul ball sound exciting, you know. But I loved Harry. I loved his enthusiasm and his excitement in his voice, that kind of thing. But Dan Kelly was so smooth and did such a great job of inflection and those kinds of things and making things exciting without going overboard, that kind of thing. And he was kind of my hero. And unfortunately, when I first got into the play-by-play aspect of it, I didn't think I did a very good job at that at all. Got too excited and got yelling and stuff like that.
Well, that's what Harry did.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Harry's my guy too.
Yeah.
In the beginning. But you were in an area, Rochelle, apparently, where KMOX and WGN, you were able to get both.
Oh, yeah. Literally, Rochelle is about 100 miles west of Chicago, 20 miles south of Rockford, if you know where that's at.
I've been to Rockford, been through Rochelle on the way up to Minneapolis, Minnesota many times.
Yep.
That was a stop, Rochelle, Illinois, believe it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So you said Harry Carey and Dan Kelly, so obviously two greats. But you said when you first started in sportscasting, was that back in Rochelle?
No.
And where was that at?
My first sportscasting job was in Ottawa, Illinois,
Ottawa, sure.
which was about 30-mile drive, 30-mile drive from Mendota.
Yeah, there's a bridge right there, I think.
Because I was actually in Mendota. My job that I had in railroad was in Mendota, which is 30 miles south of Rochelle. So I got in that part of the country, but my first job it was in Ottawa as far as sportscasting was concerned. And at Grin, you were also doing all the rest of the stuff in radio.
You mentioned Dan Kelly. Did you do hockey?
No. Didn't know squat about hockey,
I
but I loved listening to the guy.
Yeah, he unbelievable. You're right. I'm the same way. Don't know anything about hockey, but I could listen to him all day long.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what sport did you start with in Ottawa?
Football.
Football?
Yeah, I did football, basketball, and baseball in Ottawa.
And did you say you didn't think you were very good?
I was horrible.
You were horrible. Why would you say that?
Well, I had to lie to get the job, first of all.
You know.
when I went to the radio station in Ottawa, WOLI was the call letters of the station. And I went there and interviewed with this general manager who didn't know squat about sports. It was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And he said, well, how much play-by-play have you done? Because I had a tape and a resume from the Butte operation that I was out there with. And I actually had, sound checks and newscasts and things like that I had done. So I had background there, but I didn't have any play-by-play. And so the guy says, well, do you have a tape of your play-by-play? I said, no. I said, I just did the backup games in Butte, Montana. I said, and the backup games they taped and they didn't save them.
Yeah.
And he bought it. I mean, it's like, you got to be kidding me.
And didn't check on it.
Yeah, he didn't check. He never called.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got hired, and it was in July. And so a month and a half later, I got to do my first game. And I went and did the first ball game with the program director, who was going to be my color analyst and my spotter for the game. And I thought I could do it, but I'd never done it.
Football's a different animal.
It is.
Yeah.
And so I did probably, without question, the worst broadcast in the history of broadcast radio. It was pretty bad.
Yeah. You got a tape of it?
I have a tape of it. No one will ever hear it.
Okay. All right. That's okay. At least you have a tape of it.
No.
But I mean, why was it so bad?
I was so nervous.
Oh, okay.
I was just jacked up out of my mind in regard to what I was doing. I mean, literally at one point, probably midway through the first quarter, the color guy was sitting right here, and he was spotting for me. And at one point, and out of the corner of my eye, I just can see out of the corner of my eyes looking at me like this. So I knew it was bad.
Yeah.
And I knew it was bad before I ever looked at him or saw his face, or the expression on his face, but it was just really bad.
Yeah.
So I get through the broadcast. The radio station at that time signed off at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
So we're off the air, at 9:15, 9:20, something like that. I didn't go back. I was supposed to take the equipment back to the radio station, and I waited till 11 o'clock because I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want anybody to know that I had just done the worst broadcast in history. Except when I got to the radio station, I turned in the parking lot, and I can see that there's a light on,
waiting for you.
And there's the visage of the general manager standing in the doorway, waiting for me to return.
Wow.
So I walked in. He didn't say hi, how are you, or anything like that. He just went, I thought you told me you'd done play-by-play before. And I said, well, Mr. Porso, if I would have told you that I'd done play-by-play before and then did what I did tonight, I said I would have never gotten the job. And he goes, no, he starts with an S.
Yeah.
I said, what's that mean? He goes, what it means is you have 3 weeks. I thought I was fired.
Okay.
He says, in 3 weeks, if you aren't dramatically better, you're out of here.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
He got better.
So I went the next day. I got out of bed and I called a guy named Art Kimball. Art Kimball, who was at WLPO, which is 15 miles away at LaSalle, Peru. He was one of the better play-by-play guys in our area. He was the best in our area, to say the least. At any rate, I called him up. I got his number. I called him up. He didn't know me. Why would he know me? At any rate, he goes, I said, Mr. Kimball, you don't know me. My name's Don Fischer. I just got the job at WOLI in Ottawa, and I did my first game last night, and it was the worst in history. And he goes, well, how bad could it be? And I said, well, bad enough that the guy gives me 3 weeks to get better, and if I'm not better, he's going to fire me. Yeah. He goes, well, what do you want from me? I said, I would just like to be able to sit with you for a couple hours and pick your brain and have you tell me how you prepare, all that kind of stuff to get ready to do play-by-play. Yeah. He said, what are you doing tomorrow? I said, he was kind of like that too. What are you doing tomorrow? I said, I'm going to church. He says, what are you doing after church? I said, whatever you want me to. Yeah. And I went to his home at noon that day, and he spent 5 hours with me.
Wow.
Just sat down, showed me how he did spot charts, how he did statistics. He did all this stuff himself, obviously. And in high school, that's what you have to do because you're not going to have a lot of help.
Preparation.
And so he showed me how to prepare, and he showed me the important things about interviewing people and what the things that people are interested in hearing about. Like I said, he spent 5 hours with me. I took copious notes. And I've done basically what Art Kimball taught me in that 5 hour period, the entire career that I've had in broadcasting.
Wow. What did you think, though, aside from the actual broadcast itself, what did you think of your voice at that point?
I hated my voice.
Hated your voice.
Not
unusual.
Still don't like it.
Yeah. Okay.
That's how people in broadcasting are.
Yeah.
I mean, and not everybody feels that way, but I have always felt like my voice wasn't good enough. And I don't think it really was in the beginning because I don't sound the same now as I did then. It's not that much different, but the way you use your voice and the way you learn to use your voice and how you go about doing play-by-play, all of that evolves by doing it. And so the best job I ever had in broadcasting prior to Indiana was Terre Haute, Indiana.
Terre Haute.
I was there 2.5 years. I did an average of 175 play-by-plays a year.
Wow.
I was doing everything from junior football out of the back of a pickup truck with a Marty unit. People don't know what that is.
I remember the Marty unit.
Small transmitter that goes about 3 to 5 miles, something like that. And I utilized that Marty unit. Oops, I dropped this.
That's okay. I've done that a time or two.
I used that Marty unit to do junior football out of the back of a pickup truck.
Junior football, which is 10, 12-year-old?
Fifth, sixth, seventh graders.
And it was on the radio.
They allowed me to do what I wanted to do.
Oh, okay.
So I just wanted to do play-by-play.
Yeah.
And I was doing everything that I could possibly get my hands on play-by-play wise.
Where were you? WBOW? Or?
I was at WBOW.
Okay. WPFR. A little bit later than you. But I didn't realize junior football on the radio.
1970, 71, and 72. Now, we only did the junior football the first year I was there because I started doing football for the high school, all the high schools. And when I was there, Terre Haute, Wiley, Gerstmeyer, Garfield, Honey Creek, all those 4 schools, and of course they consolidated the next year. So the next year it was Terre Haute North and Terre Haute South. And the third year I was there, I just did football because they stopped the sports program at the radio station I was at BOW because a new guy, Roger Newhoff was his name, he came in from Washington, D.C., he bought the station, and they cut out the sportscast part of it. And he said after football season this year, 72, he says, we're not going to do any more sports.
Okay.
And so I left.
Yeah.
And I went back to Ottawa, Illinois.
Okay. Well, I want to get back to Ottawa, but I want to go back to 3 weeks after that first broadcast. And you had another sit down with your manager, or if you did, was he okay? Did he feel like things himself? Did he feel
never said a word.
You just kept working?
I just kept working. If he would have fired me, he'd have had to bring me in to fire me.
Yeah.
But I had obviously gotten, in his mind, I'd gotten at least better. And I don't know if he thought I don't think he thought it was great by any stretch of the imagination. But I improved pretty dramatically through the first year I did play-by-play.
So at this point, though, personally, again, you have a family, and I know how radio was back then. You moved from town to town to keep a job, and that's what you did. So you moved to Terre Haute, cut out the sports of all things.
Right.
So back to Ottawa.
Went back to Ottawa for 8 months.
Okay.
Literally the wintertime. I mean, football was over with. I left. I was hired by the program director and my color man was now the general manager of that radio station in
Mm-hmm.
Ottawa. And I called him up because we talked, stayed in
Mm-hmm.
touch, and he hired me back to help a high school kid who was pretty good for a high school guy. This kid did high school play-by-play, and he brought me back to tutor him, mentor him, and help him, just like Art Kimball had helped me.
Mm-hmm.
Except I was doing it for this kid for 6-7 months, whatever it was. But at any rate, I was hired back there, sold for them.
Yeah.
I hate sales.
Yep.
Hate it. Anyway, but I did it because I didn't have any choice,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed the job for my family. And I'd had a child in each of the places I was at. I was in Butte, Montana. We had my second child. When we were in Terre Haute, we had my third.
Mm-hmm.
And when we came to Indianapolis, I had a fourth.
Oh, all boys?
We had 4
right?
boys.
All
Yeah.
boys, yeah. Wow.
So at any rate, that's kind of
Yeah.
the trek.
Okay. So Ottawa to Indianapolis?
Ottawa to Indianapolis, yes.
And you were hired
I was
by
in
who?
Springfield, Illinois for 3 months,
Okay.
but that's another story. It's too long.
Okay.
I don't need to go into that.
All
But I
right.
was there for 3 months.
Yeah.
I didn't get fired.
Okay, that's yeah.
I didn't get fired. I
Never
was
never
actually,
got fired?
Yeah.
Never got fired.
No.
Okay.
No, I never got fired.
Because a lot of famous sportscasters, radio announcers have, as you know,
Yeah.
but never got fired. So
Should have been.
Indianapolis. Yeah. Almost was. But how did Indianapolis come about? The
My
Hoosier
old-
State, by the way.
Yeah.
He's now a Hoosier.
A guy named Harvey Glore was the general manager at Terre Haute when I left.
Okay.
Harvey was from Chicago originally. He's a really good guy, and even though I lost my job there or had to leave because they weren't going to do sports anymore, we kept in touch. I mean, he liked what I did. He thought I was really good at it. He didn't have any choice. He had to change the format because that's what the owner wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, so I get through the basketball season in 72, 73. And I started looking for jobs, and I'd sent out tapes and resumes several places, and all of a sudden I get a phone call, and it's from Harvey. And he goes, "Did you apply for the Indiana job?" And I said, "What Indiana job?" And he goes, "Indiana University's looking for a play-by-play guy to be the first official radio voice, exclusive voice of Indiana football and basketball games." And I said, I had no idea the job was open. He says, "Oh, it's been open for some time. It was in Broadcast Magazine." I said, "I never saw it. And I look at Broadcast every week." I think it was in a box, one of those box numbers that they put in there sometimes, and you don't really know what it is.
Yeah.
So I didn't see it. So Harvey goes, "Well, if you didn't know, why didn't you apply?" I said, I didn't know it was open. He goes, "I do know the general manager, not well, but he says, I know him well enough I can call him to see if they're still taking applications and tapes and resume, that type of thing." So at any rate, he calls me back about 15 minutes after I talked to him. He says, "They're still taking, there's good news and bad news. The good news is they're still taking tapes and resumes of guys who want the job." He says, "The bad news is they've got 275 other guys applied for it." I said, "You're kidding, right?" No, he said, "No, I'm not kidding." The guy said, "We have over 270 applications for this job." So I took my tape, took my resume, stuck it in the mail, sent it to him. And like 2.5 weeks later, I get a phone call. And it's the general manager at WIRE in Indianapolis. His name was Don Nelson. Program director's name was Bill Robinson. Don Nelson says, "We'd like you to come for an interview." I said, "I'm humbled to say the least."
Yeah.
He said, "Can you come in here in the next 2 or 3 days, if that's possible?" And I said, "I'll be there." So I went to WIRE, had my interview, came back home, thought I did okay, but with that many applicants, you got no clue. And there were a lot of good people that applied for the job. I was told that when I interviewed. And they called me up. They said, "We would like to hire you as the new play-by-play voice of IU and our sports director at WIRE." And I said, "I'm there."
So this is literally within 5 years of the worst football broadcast that was
Yes, sir.
ever out there
Yes, sir.
in the history of the world.
Yep.
So your general manager, Mr. Glore, must have thought you were good enough.
Harvey Glore thought I was good enough.
You
He
must
did.
have thought you were good enough.
I did. I mean, every time you make a move, as you may or may not know, you get nervous.
Right.
Because how good am I? And I was just like anybody else that would get a job like that. I wanted to be good at it
Mm-hmm.
and good enough to keep it. And I guess I was good enough to keep it.
Mm-hmm.
I've been here a while.
Do you remember what did they ask you in the interview? Just as an example, what were a question or two that?
Pretty much, they just wanted to know my background, just kind of like you're asking me right now.
Right.
Tell us where you've been,
Yeah.
how you progressed. We talked about Art Kimball a lot,
Mm-hmm.
who mentored me
Yeah.
and the kind of things that I'd done. But they pretty much knew what they were looking for, I think. I don't know why I got the job.
Yeah.
Maybe it paid me less. I don't have any idea.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But they liked what I did. They liked the sound of my voice. They liked my stuff.
But
So,
obviously, not being a native Hoosier, never living in Indiana
right.
except for that brief time, didn't have a role in it. Because
Did
I would have
not.
thought maybe they would say, "Tell us about Indiana University. Tell us everything you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Tell us why you love the university."
They never said a word about that.
It was more about the technical aspect of
Exactly.
the broadcast.
They wanted somebody that they thought sounded, could handle it,
Yeah.
would, I guess, adhere to the audience that he was broadcasting to.
Mm-hmm.
And they never said anything about, what do you know about IU or anything
Yeah.
like that. And here's the story about that. I didn't know much.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew a lot about the University of Illinois
Mm-hmm.
because that's where I grew up,
Right.
but I didn't know a lot about Indiana University. And in my first broadcast in 1973, Lee Corso's first year at Indiana,
Yeah.
in the first half of the ball game, I called Indiana University of Indiana 3 times.
Okay.
At halftime, I got a phone call from the general manager who said, "It's Indiana University, and if you say University of Indiana again, you're going to be in trouble, big boy." I said, I said, I know it was Indiana University, but I didn't even think about
Sure.
it because I'm so used to saying University of Illinois.
Yeah.
And he goes, "I understand your problem." He says, "Let's make it a non-problem,
Yeah.
and let's go from there." And here's the oddity. Max Gerber, who was my color analyst for 24 years, was the play-by-play guy when I got here. He had been the play-by-play voice of IU for 6 years. He was not a happy camper that I was taking his spot, and he was allowed to stay on the broadcast because the IU Alumni Association wanted him. He was a guy that traveled around the state and spoke to alumni groups and things like that. They wanted his name to still be out there, and the broadcasting operation that we had would allow that to happen and actually give him more exposure because we had more radio stations on our network at that time than they did when he was doing the play-by-play.
Right.
Because I think they only had 15 stations that were doing his broadcast, and then they were allowing radio stations from around the state. Anybody who wanted to pay a rights fee could come in and broadcast too. So there were 4 and 5 broadcasts of IU on a given Saturday, in addition to the IU Alumni Association network.
Okay.
So at any rate, Max was not a happy camper that I got the gig and knocked him out of his position, and I understand that. But they put him on the broadcast as our color analyst. Well, we survived 24 years together, which, we became friends and obviously built a relationship, that kind of thing. But initially, he wasn't happy. You would have thought that he would have told me after I said University of Indiana the first time.
No, he was going to let you hang.
No, he let me die on the vine.
Yeah. I'm sure you reminded him of that.
Not that much.
No. Okay.
It was my fault. It wasn't his fault. But at the same time.
So yeah, I remember him. But he was the announcer, but they opened it up. So he knew he wasn't going to be the
Correct.
announcer, but he wasn't the basketball announcer, right?
No, he did both.
Oh, he was the exclusive for both. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. He did both for their network, the Alumni Association network, which was not exclusive.
Right. Okay. So this was over here at Memorial Stadium. Is that right?
Yep.
For the football. So that would have been the fall of '73.
Correct.
All right. So now the basketball season. Not that I was going to mention Bob Knight, but Bob Knight's the coach over here.
That's right.
What, second or third year?
Third
something
year.
like that. So you have to develop a relationship, get these interviews with Mr. Knight. Intimidated?
Totally.
Totally?
Now, here's why. I mean, I'd interviewed coaches and all that kind of stuff through my career, and I wasn't nervous about interviewing coaches or anything like that. But my boss, when I first got here, when we got closer to the basketball season, they hadn't started practice yet, but it was getting close to, I don't know, early October. And Don Nelson brought me into his office and he said, "Look, you're about to start basketball. We have offered the coach an opportunity to do a pregame show prior to every broadcast or prior to every game. And your job is going to be to get that interview each and every ball game for Indiana University, period. And I said, yeah, okay. And he goes, well, what you don't know is that Coach Knight has a reputation for not really liking the media very much, number one. And number two, he's kind of ornery in many respects. And they said, but your job is to get that interview, and you need to do whatever you have to do to get it.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay. And then I started talking to some people about Coach Knight and found out, because I knew some writers and everything, you know, I'd met guys. And these guys were like, well, we don't envy you at all.
Oh, my gosh.
So at any rate, now I'm getting really getting nervous about the whole scenario. So the very first time I get to meet him, he is speaking at the Columbia Club in Indianapolis at an IU tip-off luncheon. And so I go into the club, or I go to the Columbia Club with Max Gerber and Don Luft. I don't know if you remember that name or not.
I remember the name, sure.
Don Luft was I think at that time that I got here, he was the head of the varsity club.
Okay.
And he also had been a 3-star athlete at Indiana back in the early 50s, football, basketball, baseball. And he knew Coach Knight. And so he said, I will introduce you to Coach Knight at this Columbia Club luncheon. I said, okay. So we went to the Columbia Club, Max, Don Luft, and myself, sat down, listened to Coach Knight. He was tremendous, as he always was in those situations. You could already tell that he was an intimidating figure. And the way he talked to, in his presentation, all that kind of stuff, you knew people weren't screwing with him. So at any rate, we get through with the luncheon, and of course people coming up around him and all that kind of stuff and talking to him. And Don says, just hang in there. We'll get a chance to introduce you to the coach. So I'm waiting, and finally he gets through with his pictures and autographs and all those kinds of things and talking to people. And Luft hails him and says, Coach, I want you to meet somebody. So he comes over, and Max and I and Luft are all standing there. And Luft goes, this is Don Fischer, a new play-by-play guy. And I stick out my hand, and he shakes my hand, but he doesn't say a word to me. He looks me right in the eye, doesn't say a word. And then he turns around, puts his arm around Max Gerber, and then he walks him away.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Immediately, I knew my place.
Yeah, but you got the interviews.
I did.
What was if you can, what was the most difficult not encounter, but how you had to go about to get the interview? Because I'm assuming there's some late nights, some early mornings, just at his availability, right?
Well, it was his availability, but we established very early on when the best time for me to come down to do the interview would be, and it was always on game day. He never had a problem in doing the interview on game day, and it was generally at home. It was 3.5 hours before tip. That's when the team was done with their walkthrough. Okay. And then the team would go eat, and he would do our interview at that point in time. Some days it went longer, and he would go someplace else and then come back and do it then. But he always would do it early on in the day.
Did you ever have to do a post-game show with him?
No. Thank God.
Yeah. I remember the Chuck Marlowe days, and interviewing him.
Well, in my opinion, Chuck was the perfect foil for Coach.
He was. Because
Chuck always would, he would lead with a question that was really a declaration of a statement, about what he knew about basketball. Yeah. And Coach Knight would always, well, Chuck, that's not right. You know how that was. I mean, if you watch those shows, you sit there and laugh at it because you knew what Chuck was going to do, and then Coach would just basically berate him for saying what he said or totally destroy everything that he just said, that kind of thing. So it was just different, but it was entertaining, and that's what people watched it for. I mean, his shows were as watched as any, and of course those were too.
Stay up late at night.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. I wish we had a lot more, but we don't. So there's so much more, of course, that could be covered with you. But I did want to ask you one thing, and the kind of stand-up microphone that you use.
Yes, sir.
Do you still use that?
Yes, sir.
So tell me.
Well, let's put it this way. I use it in basketball. In football, I hold it.
Okay.
I don't have to stand up.
Obviously comfort, but the origins of that, I mean,
Well,
because basically today people wear the headsets and they've got the microphone.
Right.
But you have the stand-up mic and you have an earpiece. So can you enlighten us on that?
Well, I use the stand-up microphone because that's what I grew up. You know, that's what I wanted in my broadcasting career. That's primarily what I used.
Okay.
And I like it. I like my hands free. You know, if I can get them free, because I write in basketball. I keep my own stats. Not everything, but I keep the scoring.
You mean even today?
Yes.
Okay.
I keep my own stats from a scoring standpoint of what each individual player is doing. Free throws, field goals, three-point field goals, personal fouls, all those kinds of things I keep on a stat board.
Okay.
So I've done that since the very beginning.
Yeah.
And you get used to doing something, and that's the way you decide to do it. In football, I don't keep stats in football. There's no way you could.
No.
And that's why I really started using the handheld. And we used to use 635s, which is for those who don't know, it's just a microphone. It's about that long, and it's very easy to hold and all that kind of thing.
Okay.
I use a bigger microphone now. It's one that it's like a great big pickle. At any rate, it's just different. And from my standpoint, I hate headsets because my ears sweat.
Yeah.
And I just don't like them. So I use earbuds instead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just let it be known, Lagodi Lion fans, I have a guy that helps me with stats. Don Fischer. He has to do it himself, right?
Not. I don't do all the stats.
You got the monitor right in front of you, don't you?
They use the monitor. I just don't use the
monitor. You know, I did always wonder, Don, because you will say Trey Galloway scores, he's got 6. I mean, whatever it is, right off the bat.
Right.
That's because you're keeping it.
Yes.
I wondered about that because I thought you are quick to look at that monitor, but that's not the case.
I'm not that quick.
You've got it on your own. That's amazing, though.
No, I don't use the monitor hardly at all.
Okay. One last question. 50-some years, how long are you going?
That I don't know. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. If you've got your health and you still like what you're doing, and I'm not doing anything I don't like doing anymore. Yeah. I do the coaches shows and I do the play-by-play for football and basketball, and that's it. I mean, when I'm done with basketball season, I have 3-4 months to play golf.
You know, avid golfer.
I'm going to be 77 in September, or the 26th of September, and I tell everybody the same thing. They say, well, when are you going to give it up? I said, well, when I don't feel like I'm doing a good job, number one, or number two, I'm not enjoying it anymore. And I still enjoy it. I've never announced that I'm going to, I mean, I've had so many people think I was retiring because of the 50-year celebration that everybody put on this past year of me celebrating my 50th year here. And I've had people come up and they thought I'd retired. No, I haven't retired yet. I mean, I will at some point, unless I die first.
but don't you find it a challenge, though, at age 77? I mean, you're in great shape, but football and basketball, just to keep up, they're both mentally draining at your level, I'm sure.
Yeah.
On your way home, you've got to be just mentally drained. But you don't see yourself giving up one or the other over the next few years just to cut back?
I haven't really thought about it. Okay. I mean, I'd like both. If people say, well, which sport do you like doing the best? I like doing any play-by-play.
Yeah,
I'd do baseball again if it was out there for me. You know, if I had the time and all that kind of stuff, and baseball would be harder for me now because at this juncture I haven't done it for years.
Yeah,
and you've got to have that knowledge.
Yeah,
baseball is another sport where you're not just doing play-by-play. You're talking.
Yeah.
You're talking about a lot of different things in a baseball game and filling time. Exactly.
Yeah. Don Fischer, thanks so much.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Don did not have to do this. He knows that, but he was so accommodating, and he's got a big-time schedule even today, so we're going to let him go. But I hope you got to know a little bit more about this Indiana neighbor, not a native Hoosier, but Don Fischer, an icon here at Indiana University. Thank you so much for watching.